Every day, I put out a short form piece of content about something I found on the internet that needs to be addressed. This week, I had two pieces on Donald Trump. Now, before we discuss Donald Trump, I do not care if you are a Democrat who hates Trump, and I do not care if you are a Republican who loves him. What I do care about is how concerned I am after seeing a lot of comments in the comment section of my two shorts. So I decided I needed to turn this week's political article into a Donald Trump historical fact piece. I want to fix society. And for us all to fix society, we have to push past the hate and we need to be able to have conversations about things at face value. And I'm not talking about your right to say this should have happened or this shouldn't have happened. I'm talking about that we have to agree that we will agree on what actually did happen. So today we're going to go through it all about Donald Trump and his New York court cases. We're going to talk about the civil case, the criminal case, the verdicts, the appeals, the sentencing, and then I'm going to address some rumors that have been floating around. Two cases in two courts with two very different outcomes. By the way, if you prefer written, there is an article in the description below or a link right there in the corner. Now, the first case to reach trial was the civil fraud case. But I believe what confuses people is that Donald Trump was indicted on the 30th of March, 2023, and he was indicted on a criminal case. That began his legal troubles, except the civil fraud case went to trial on October 2nd, 2023, and the civil fraud case has absolutely nothing to do with his Class E felonies. On February 16th, the judge ruled that Trump had committed fraud by inflating the value of his assets to secure better loans and insurance terms. And the penalty imposed was staggering: $355 million, a 3-year ban on running a business in New York, and Donald Jr. and Eric are barred from serving in leadership roles. And the Trump organization was cut off from loans from banks registered in New York. Now, Trump's legal team did appeal, and that was the appeal that we got the verdict on this week, August 21st, where the appellate court overturned the $355 million penalty, calling it excessive. But here's the important part. The fraud finding still exists. The fraud finding wasn't overturned. Donald Trump is still legally recognized as having engaged in fraudulent conduct. The liability is still there, even though the financial penalty changed. This is one of those situations where those are the facts. If you want to argue the opinion, and I would love to argue the opinion with you, because although I am not a Donald Trump fan, I am not a Donald Trump supporter, he didn't do anything in business that every other business does, including businesses in New York. Yes, everybody always overinflates the value of their equity so that they can get better loan, better terms, better conditions. The only time anybody ever undervalues their equity is when they're trying to avoid paying more in property taxes. But all of those are the should not part of the discussion. And I want to encourage that. But if we won't agree on the facts of what happened, then the should and should not is irrelevant. What came next was the criminal case. And it came on the heels of the civil fraud finding, when there wasn't enough time for society, the populace, the people, mainstream media to run the civil finding into exhaustion. And the reason why is it happened. February was the civil finding, April was the start of the criminal trial, and the presidential election was in full swing. The criminal trial began on April 15th with the jury selection. Opening statements were on April 22nd, and on May 30th, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all 34 counts. At that moment, Donald Trump became a convicted felon. A conviction in New York happens when the verdict is rendered, accepted by the judge, signed, and turned over to the clerk of the court. Now, people are going to want to now immediately jump into they shouldn't have been felonies. And we'll get there. Donald Trump's sentencing didn't happen until January 10th of 2025, when the judge issued an unconditional discharge. That means no jail, no probation, no fine. But again, an unconditional discharge did not erase the convictions. Donald Trump is still a convicted felon. Now, his legal team has filed an appeal in the appellate division, First Department, and that appeal has not been heard yet. Also, the U.S. Supreme Court has not heard any part of the case involving Donald Trump's conviction. The Supreme Court has only ruled on a small sliver of a case where Donald Trump requested delay in sentencing, and that is where he argued presidential immunity. And I'm not going to talk about the presidential immunity part in this video because that's not related to the New York case. But ultimately, the Supreme Court did not rule in favor of Donald Trump on delayed sentencing. That's why Judge Meechan issued the unconditional discharge. Now, there's a lot of bits and bobs here that people are going to bring up. And some of those are things like Trump isn't convicted until sentenced. Well, that's flat wrong. And if you work in a law office and you believe that, I'm scared that this poster on TikTok says they work in law. Conviction is official when the jury renders the guilty verdict. And even if you believed otherwise, Trump was sentenced. The unconditional discharge is still a sentence. The Supreme Court overturned his conviction. This is false. No court has overturned his conviction. The U.S. Supreme Court only weighed in on the delayed sentencing. This case still has to make its way through the lowest level appeal, and then the state highest court of appeal, which is the equivalent of the New York Supreme Court, and then and only then can it go to the federal court. The civil penalty was overturned, so Trump was cleared of fraud. Incorrect. One of the penalties was overturned. The $355 million settlement was overturned. The other penalties, the bank loans, the Junior and Eric can't serve in leadership positions, those are all punishments from the fraud finding. Trump is a violent felon. No, his crimes were white-collar felonies. He is a convicted felon. He is not what is classified as a violent offender. And on this one, many people are going to say, but he is violent because he sent the troops into D.C. and he dehumanized illegal immigrants and he sicked ICE on them and he deported a man to a country where he shouldn't have been deported. And all of those are facts, but they have nothing to do with the terminology of violent criminal, violent felon, violent offender. These should never have been felonies. This is a huge one. And again, I am not a Trump supporter. I am not a member of Make America Great Again. I am not a Democrat. I don't believe either party is right. But what I will say is the facts of the matter is this. Falsifying business records is normally charged as a misdemeanor. Under New York law, it can become a felony if it is done with the intent to commit or conceal another crime. Prosecutors did not have to prove Trump committed that underlying crime, only that he falsified records with intent to cover something criminal. The jury was instructed that they had to unanimously agree with the intent, but they did not have to agree on which exact specific underlying crime. That is controversial, and it is legally permissible in New York. And the citizens and the residents of New York, regardless of if you love Donald Trump or hate Donald Trump, should be actively working to change that procedure, to change that law, because that is a terrible law. And if you want to say that's a great law, tell me why that's a great law in the comments below without mentioning Donald Trump. Here's where everything stands. Trump lost both cases. In the civil case, the fraud remains. In the criminal case, the felony convictions remain. Talking about facts doesn't mean dismissing opinions. What it means is that we have to all be talking about the same facts. And if we're going to become subjective about which facts we accept, then no conversation can take place. No improvement can happen. People can and should debate these cases, whether they should have even been brought, whether the penalties make sense, whether it was all the fact that Donald Trump was a Republican that the Democratic Party seemingly couldn't stop. So a strong state with the ability to charged him in order to keep him off the campaign trail and potentially put him in jail. But those are different conversations. There is what did happen, and there is what things people should or should not have happened. Acknowledging the legal and historical record does not mean you agree with it. It means you recognize the difference between evidence and interpretation, between the courtroom record and the court of public opinion. If you want more breakdowns like this, subscribing to my channel is the best way to support me. And don't forget, there is a full written article with all the details in the description below.